You've done it. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but you've done it. Someone asks a question you know the answer to, and instead of answering, you hesitate. You soften your voice. You say something like, "I'm not sure, but maybe," and then offer the exact right answer, wrapped in enough uncertainty that no one can really hold you to it. Or maybe it goes the other way. Someone explains something to you slowly, like you're a child, and you just let them. You nod along. You don't correct them. You don't say, "Actually, I already know this." You just play along. And by the end of this, you'll understand why playing dumb is sometimes the most sophisticated thing a human mind can do, and why that insight changes everything about how you see intelligence, power, and the way we protect ourselves from each other. Let's start with the paradox that sits at the heart of this. We live in a culture obsessed with being seen as smart. Think about how much social energy goes into signaling competence. The right vocabulary, the right references, the way you respond in meetings, the books on your shelf that you half read but mention anyway. We are deeply invested in being perceived as intelligent. And yet, all around us, people are constantly pretending to know less than they do. Not out of stupidity, out of something far more strategic. The philosopher Erving Goffman, in his 1959 book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, argued that social life is essentially a performance. We are always, in every interaction, managing what other people see of us. And one of the most underappreciated tools in that performance is strategic incompetence. The deliberate, carefully calibrated act of appearing less capable, less informed, or less certain than you actually are. The conventional view says this is weakness. It says playing dumb is what insecure people do, what people pleasers do, what people who are afraid of confrontation do. And that view isn't entirely wrong, but it's incomplete. Because if playing dumb were simply a symptom of low self-esteem, we wouldn't see it everywhere. We wouldn't see it in the most politically powerful rooms in the world. We wouldn't see it in the most emotionally intelligent people we know. The conventional framing misses something enormous, and chasing that missing piece is exactly what this video is about. Here's where it gets interesting. Psychologists have spent decades studying a phenomenon called impression management, which is just a clinical way of saying what Goffman was already pointing at. We are always sculpting how others perceive us, and the tools we use are often invisible to us. One of the most fascinating findings in this area came from a series of studies by researchers at Harvard and Yale in the early 2000s. They found that experts in a room, people who genuinely know more than everyone else, are often liked less. Not because of arrogance, but simply because competence creates distance. When someone clearly knows more than you, there's an asymmetry, a gap, and gaps are uncomfortable. They make people feel small. And people who feel small often become defensive, hostile, or withdrawn. So what do highly competent people learn to do? Sometimes consciously, and sometimes completely without realizing it. They soften their expertise. They ask questions they already know the answers to. They preface their insights with, "I could be wrong, but..." They create the impression of uncertainty, even when they're fairly certain. Not because they're lying, but because they've learned, often through painful experience, that being right can cost you the room. There's a name for this in social psychology. It's called the pratfall effect, and it was first documented by psychologist Elliot Aronson in 1966. Aronson found that highly competent people actually become more likable when they make small mistakes or reveal small vulnerabilities. A brilliant person who occasionally stumbles is more attractive, more trustworthy, and more approachable than a brilliant person who never does. The stumble humanizes them. It closes the gap. And once people understood this dynamic, they started doing it deliberately, whether they realized it or not. Think about the last time you were in a meeting and the most senior person in the room said, "Help me understand this," about something they almost certainly already understood. Or think about the last time a highly accomplished friend described their own work with exaggerated humility, making it sound far more ordinary than it was. You probably didn't think of it as deception. It didn't feel like lying. It felt like them being approachable, down to earth. And that's exactly the point. The performance is smooth enough that we don't see the performance. Now I want to sit with the darker edge of this for a moment, because it's important not to romanticize what we're talking about. Playing dumb is not always strategic brilliance. Sometimes it is exactly what the cynical reading says it is: avoidance. Sometimes we pretend not to know something because knowing it would require us to act on it, and acting on it is frightening or costly. This is what psychologists call motivated ignorance. And it's been studied extensively by researchers like Francesca Gino at Harvard Business School. Her work shows that people will actively avoid information that would create moral discomfort, not because they're uninformed, but because they prefer not to be informed. If knowing something obligates you, sometimes not knowing it feels safer. We see this in relationships all the time. You know something is wrong, the signs are there, but you don't ask the question that would confirm it, because confirming it means you have to deal with it. And so you play dumb, not to anyone else, but to yourself. And that version of playing dumb, that self-directed version, is genuinely costly. It's not strategic, it's not clever. It's the slow erosion of your own honesty. There's another layer here that connects to power, and this is where it gets philosophically rich. Throughout history, marginalized groups have used strategic incompetence as a survival tool. The scholar James C. Scott called this weapons of the weak. In situations where open resistance is dangerous, people learn to perform compliance while quietly preserving their actual knowledge, their actual capabilities, their actual defiance. The enslaved person who acts confused when asked about a plan. The worker who doesn't understand the policy that would make them easier to exploit. The woman in a patriarchal household who lets her husband believe he's the smarter one because challenging that belief directly would cost her something she can't afford to lose. This is playing dumb as an act of self-preservation, and once you see it in that light, it becomes impossible to dismiss as mere weakness. It's sophisticated, it's adaptive, and it carries enormous psychological costs, because performing a lesser version of yourself, even strategically, is exhausting. It leaves a residue. Over time, the performance starts to feel less like a costume and more like a skin. Carl Jung talked about what he called the persona, the mask we wear in social situations. He wasn't using that word negatively. He understood that personas serve a function. You cannot walk through life with no filter between your inner world and everyone else. But Jung also warned about what happens when the persona becomes too thick, when you forget that there's a self underneath it. He called that persona inflation. And it's precisely what can happen when playing dumb stops being a tool you use and starts being a role you live. I've been there, honestly. There have been moments in my own life where I shrank my knowledge to fit a room. And at first it felt smart, strategic, even kind. And then one day, I realized I couldn't quite remember what I actually thought anymore. That I'd smoothed myself down so many times that I'd lost track of where I ended and the performance began. That's not strategy. That's dissolution. So what do we do with all of this? The reframe I want to offer isn't stop playing dumb. That would be naive. Because as we've seen, some forms of this behavior are deeply functional, genuinely protective, and even morally necessary in certain contexts. The reframe is more nuanced than that, and it comes from a distinction that the ancient Greeks would have recognized immediately. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, described a concept called phronesis, practical wisdom. Not just knowing what is true, but knowing when and how to act on truth. Phronesis is the virtue that governs judgment in particular situations. And one of the things Aristotle understood is that wisdom is context sensitive. The honest response is not always the loud one. The courageous response is not always the confrontational one. There is a form of intelligence that knows when to speak and when to be quiet, when to reveal and when to withhold. And that form of intelligence deserves more credit than we typically give it. The Stoics had a related concept. Epictetus, who was himself enslaved for much of his life, wrote extensively about the distinction between what is in our control and what is not. He understood, with particular depth, what it means to preserve your inner freedom while appearing to conform to an external world you cannot change. There's a kind of playing dumb that is Stoic in the truest sense. You do not feed your genuine self to a world that isn't ready for it. You protect it. You carry it quietly. And you choose with intention when it's worth revealing. Viktor Frankl, who survived the Nazi concentration camps and wrote Man's Search for Meaning, observed that even in the most brutal conditions of total powerlessness, human beings retained what he called the last of human freedoms, the freedom to choose one's response to a given situation. In the camps, many prisoners learned to manage what the guards knew about them, what they hoped for, what they believed. Playing dumb in that context was not weakness. It was the subtle exercise of the only autonomy that remained. What these thinkers share is an understanding that intelligence, true intelligence, is not just about what you know. It's about what you do with what you know. And sometimes the wisest thing you can do with knowledge is hold it close. But here's the tension that remains, and I don't want to paper over it with philosophy. There is a real difference between strategic withholding and chronic self-erasure, between choosing when to reveal your intelligence and being so conditioned by fear that you've forgotten you had it. The line between them is internal. It's the difference between I'm choosing not to show this and I'm afraid to show this. One comes from agency, the other comes from fear. And that distinction matters enormously for your long-term sense of self. Erich Fromm, in Escape from Freedom, made an argument that still unsettles me. He said that one of the deepest human anxieties is not actually the fear of danger. It's the fear of freedom. Because freedom means responsibility. It means you can't hide behind, I didn't know. And so we sometimes collude in our own ignorance. We play dumb not to protect ourselves from others, but to protect ourselves from ourselves. From the weight of knowing what we know and having to live accordingly. That's the version of playing dumb that I think deserves our most honest attention. Not the strategic version, not the socially adaptive version, but the version where we look away from something true because looking at it directly would change us. Now let's talk about what you can actually do with any of this. Because I know that intellectually digesting a concept and actually shifting your behavior are two completely different things, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. The first thing I'd invite you to consider is this. Notice the last time you played dumb, and ask yourself honestly which category it fell into. Was it strategic? Was it protective? Was it kind? Or was it avoidance? You don't need to judge yourself for the answer. The question itself is useful. Most of us go through life performing behaviors we've never examined because they developed so early and got reinforced so consistently that they feel like personality rather than habit. Just naming which kind of playing dumb you're doing is a meaningful act of self-knowledge. The second thing is harder. If you notice a pattern of shrinking your intelligence in a particular relationship or environment, ask yourself what it would cost you to stop. Not whether you should stop immediately, not whether it's fair that you have to hide. Just, what would it cost? Because sometimes the cost is genuinely too high, and that's information. If the cost of being fully yourself in a particular context is so high that you can't afford it, that's worth knowing consciously. Not as resignation, but as clarity. You can then make choices about that context with your eyes open instead of just performing automatically. The third invitation is perhaps the most intimate. It's about the version of playing dumb that you do with yourself. The information you're avoiding. The question you've been not asking. The conclusion you've been circling around for months or years. I'm not going to tell you to confront it head on because I know it's not that simple. But I'll say this. There's usually a version of that truth you already know. A part of you that has already arrived at the conclusion and is waiting patiently for the rest of you to catch up. The playing dumb you do with yourself rarely saves you from the thing you're avoiding. It usually just delays the arrival and charges you interest in the form of low-level anxiety, restlessness, and a vague sense that something isn't right. Most psychological traditions, from cognitive behavioral therapy to Jungian analysis to Buddhist mindfulness, would agree on at least this. Awareness is not the same as action, but it's almost always the beginning of it. You don't have to know what to do with a truth to let yourself fully know it. Knowing it clearly is its own form of integrity. Here's where I want to land this. The psychology of playing dumb is not a story about dishonesty. It's a story about the complexity of living in a social world while trying to maintain a private self. We play dumb for love. We play dumb for safety. We play dumb for belonging. We play dumb because we learned, somewhere along the way, that being too visible was dangerous or costly or exhausting. And those lessons were often true in the contexts where we learned them. But we carry those lessons forward into context where they no longer apply. And the work, if there is work to do here, is not about being louder or more assertive or braver in some dramatic sense. It's about the quieter, more continuous practice of knowing your own mind well enough to tell the difference between choosing to conceal and being afraid to reveal. Between wisdom and hiding. Between strategy and self-betrayal. The philosopher Simone Weil wrote something that I keep coming back to. She said, "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." I think she was right, and I think it applies here not just to how we attend to others, but to how we attend to ourselves. The most courageous thing, sometimes, is not to speak up in a room. It's to stop lying to yourself about why you didn't. This conversation connects to something much larger, the ongoing, genuinely difficult project of understanding why we do what we do, and whether those reasons still serve us. If that's the kind of conversation you want to keep having, subscribing means you won't miss the next one. And I'll leave you with this question if you want to take it with you. Where in your life are you playing dumb right now? And who taught you that it was necessary?